Welcome to the Bryce and Rhonda Work the Case podcast.
Every week, we take a real case study from professional service engagements and break it down. What was sold, what actually happened in delivery, and the root cause of where things started to go wrong.
And we're not just talking theory here. We show how most projects break down slowly across the agreement, the milestones, the work, and the way it's managed.
So we work the case step by step to understand where it really went wrong and how to fix it.
I'm Rhonda Lee.
And I'm Bryce Holloway.
And this is the Bryce and Rhonda Work the Case podcast.
Welcome back, everybody, to Bryce and Rhonda Work the Case. We're on episode 2 now. This is a big milestone. Okay. We're moving along. This is really great. We're going to talk about a specific case today, which is quite interesting / distressing. There was a number of failure points. This one's going to be something we discuss over the next several podcast episodes, mainly because there's just a lot to unpack here. And there's a lot of good learnings, right? The reason we want to unpack all this stuff is so we can learn along the way together and either do better in our own work or help others that we're working with to do better in theirs. Rhonda, give us an overview, if you would, of what is this case and what happened along this case. Just start us off.
Yeah, so this is definitely one of those cases where on the surface, it looks like the failure was at execution, but it actually started way before that. And then it was just a tumbling block down, right? We were talking about in our last podcast episode that if you don't start things out right, it just cascades down the whole execution chain, right? And so that was definitely what happened here. So I was working with a healthcare organization, and I need to preface that I have worked with multiple healthcare organizations. So don't make any assumptions as to which healthcare organization I am speaking about.
Even if it sounds like you.
Yes, I have worked for numerous healthcare organizations. So this is a healthcare organization that I was working with, and this was a huge project. We were migrating from Salesforce into Zoho. And so we had a vendor who was building out the Zoho system. We were also on top of that creating client portals that was going to integrate in with Zoho. So we had a vendor for this building out the Zoho. We had a vendor building out the client portals. And for the first 6 months of the project, it was being managed by some upper management. But unfortunately, that upper management was not explicitly clear on what they wanted. They were very vague. And so for the first 6 months, they wandered in the desert, like nothing happened.
So give me a little more detail on that. It was managed by upper management. There was an individual who was in charge of it. How much did they really weigh in? How much were they actually involved other than owning it from the top?
So this person was quite high in the hierarchy of the company. I would say the highest without anything. This person had decided what the project would entail and what they wanted. And so they were the ones that went out and found these vendors and established the expectations, or we're going to get into the lack of expectations. They were the ones that started the whole project.
And this was all based on something they decided they needed. I assume I hope there was consultation with other people in the company to say, is this something we need and why? And there was some understanding of that.
There was definitely some understanding that it was definitely needed. The organization had been struggling, and it really was at a breaking point. Something significant had to happen, or they were possibly going to go out of business.
Okay, so this wasn't at a whim. This was actual value to the company, which is great.
No, absolutely. Not just on a whim, desperately needed, had been promised for a long time, to the extent that most of the employees didn't think it was actually going to ever happen. They're like, yeah, you guys have been saying that for a long time. That kind of thing, right? Yeah. And so when I say that the expectations were very vague, they were to the extent of, okay, vendor, build us client portals. That was it. And I see this a lot in companies where they turn to their IT resources, and the IT resources, yeah, they can write code, they can build things, but they're not operations experts, right? But so many of these organizations rely on their IT people to be the operations experts, which is also another issue related to this, but not necessarily related directly to the topic that we're talking about. But that's how these people were being treated. Was we want a client portal, you know how to do the coding, so that means you know what components are necessary in a client portal, and that's not actually true.
So what was given to the vendors, there was an understanding, we need this thing. It's very valuable for the company. We need some vendors to do it. We're not going to do it in-house, right? They made that decision. They go to the vendors, and all that they were given as vendors was, hey, we want some client portals, make those, as if that's a standard commodity that can just be done.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
And then the same thing to the person who was building our new CRM. We see this a lot. We see CRMs used to fulfill services, which that's not what they're built to do. They're built to maintain client relationships. And by that, it's for the sale, right? To sell the product. It's not necessarily for the fulfillment, depending on what that product is. But if it's a commodity, yeah, maybe it's a little bit easier. But if it's a service that has multiple steps in it, that's where you run into trouble. But people are constantly trying to make their CRMs work for their processes. They had started out in Salesforce, and despite the process being rather complex in and of itself, Salesforce was still too robust for what they needed. And it took too long to make changes and adapt the system to what was needed. So the decision was made that it would migrate from Salesforce into Zoho. So one of the struggles was that obviously a new system had to be built into this new CRM, but when the instructions were given to that vendor, it was very high level of we need to be able to capture this and then do this. But there were a lot of missed steps. There were a lot of nuances to it. And that was the nature of the business model. There was some efficiency improvements that could be made, and they were made prior to this project. But the nature of the business model is that it was complex and occasionally nuanced.
Yeah. Which is common, right?
Oh, yeah, it's common, right? If everybody's business model was the same, then there would be no reason for people to have different businesses. Yeah. So that's the whole idea. You want to differentiate yourself. And they had differentiated themselves based off of this somewhat complex and nuanced process. But the more nuances you introduce into your process, the harder it is to scale. And that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to scale. They were rapidly growing, like I said, and they had reached this point to where they had growing pains, which every startup hopes that they have. But it was really something that had to happen, or it was going to completely come crashing down like a house of cards.
So they decided they needed this work. They had a number of different vendors, but the agreement with the vendors, I assume there was a separate one with each, as you would have, for doing different parts of the work. And each one of those was just as vague. We need client portal, for example, or we need this integration. Was there more detail in that?
That's a really good question. I was brought in after those 6 months. I was brought in to take over the project, and I was given 3 months. I never saw those contracts.
Oh, so the actual agreements with those vendors, you didn't even see when
I never saw. I received verbal instruction from the person who had been overseeing the project prior to that and who had hired me to do the project. I received verbal confirmation from them as to what it was that they wanted.
Let me understand the scope a little bit, because I think there's some pieces in here that will help us to be like, what? Mm-hmm. So they had wandered in the desert for 6 months, you mentioned, but during that 6 month time frame, how many vendors did they contract to do this generic work?
There were 3. Okay. And the other thing too is, prior to me coming on, none of the vendors had talked to each other. That was another thing. Okay. They had never talked to each other, even though these different components were supposed to work together.
So they were supposed to integrate together in the final solution.
Yes.
But none of them had even talked to each other. Did they know about each other but hadn't talked, or did they not even really have
They knew about each other, yes. But I got the idea, I wasn't necessarily specifically told this, but I got the idea that they were discouraged from talking with each other.
Okay. That's always really helpful.
Yeah.
Were they all brought on about the same time? Just to get an idea of how much time was wasted across all of these different groups.
I don't know for sure, but it's my understanding they all were brought on around the same time. And the person overseeing the project would meet with them. They were even having weekly meetings. And really what it was, they would come to this meeting and they would say, okay, this is what I have so far. And the feedback would be what they wanted different. So there was a lot of work and then rework. The only guidance that they really got was they would present what they had come up with so far based off of just their own design, their own knowledge. And this person would say, no, go do this differently now. I want it this way. And no, okay, go do this differently now. I want it that way, that kind of stuff. They were so frustrated by the time I came on.
Oh, sure. It's just like the story of the man who says, bring me a rock. And you bring him a rock and he says, no, not that rock.
Exactly. Oh, no, that's
and you go
exactly
back and
what was
try
happening.
again and you say this and then no, not that rock.
Yeah.
And you just do that until you hit it.
Yeah.
You can't do work that way. You can work, I
Yes.
guess, and
Yes.
you can bill, but you're not actually going to get work done in a kind of effective manner doing it like
Yes.
that. So that's very interesting. So these vendors were given extremely vague, we want you to do this thing. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It sounds right.
Yeah.
When was the expected timeline? I guess we should start with that one.
I honestly don't know what the original expected timeline was. I just know
Okay.
that when I was brought, they had been working on it for 6 months, and I was told I had 3 months. And there were some very explicit reasons, and there was no negotiation on that. Whatever we
That's-
have in 3 months. And that includes migrating all the data from the original CRM into the new CRM.
Okay. And we could talk podcasts about data migration.
Yeah.
For a long
Oh my gosh.
We won't get into that.
Yes, that's going to be a whole other one. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you came in, 6 months had passed already. You never saw an agreement or a contract. Is that because they were just trying to silo that from you? Or do you suspect there weren't hard agreements on those things? Clearly there was some payment agreements, some financial side of that. What are we going to pay you to do that? Vendors wouldn't work without that, of course.
Yeah.
But there was no agreements that you ever saw. No explicit timeline was ever given to you about what was there originally. But then you come in and they're like, all right, you only have half the amount of time we've currently spent to finish it. How do you tackle something like that? And what was the process you used to get an understanding of what they had done so far and where to go?
To answer your first question about the agreement, why did I not see it? I do believe there was an agreement, if for no other reason, to agree on payment, right? Agree on an hourly rate. There probably were some vague deliverables outlined in it. My guess is obviously it was vague because they didn't know what they were doing. It probably was to the extent of you will build a client portal. That's probably what it was. I don't think that it was kept from me to hide the fact that it was vague, because this person probably didn't even realize how vague it was. I think it was kept from me because, and these are personal assumptions, right? It was just this person's MO. They liked to control information. And so they did.
That's also very common, right?
Oh, yeah.
And I think it's not healthy. Sometimes it's a direct reflection on the individual.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's just people's personalities. And I don't know if that's super healthy across an organization. Some information I would agree with needs to be kept confidential at different levels. I'm not saying that, but for getting work done, and we touched on this in the last episode, there needs to be some clear visibility of the agreement along the entire team, right? To say, this is what we're getting done. This is what we've agreed to get done, and go from there. So that's very interesting. That wasn't available to anybody, including you, who they brought in to fix the problems. What was the other part of that?
The first thing that I did was obviously the first thing that I always do. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? Even though this person didn't show me the contract, I still got verbal, right? So I took note of that. And then I knew to ask questions. So you want client portals. What is the purpose, the intent of having these client portals? What is it you're wanting to accomplish with these client portals? That kind of thing. This person had very distinct changes that they wanted to make to some of the way they did billing. And one of the reasons I believe that I was brought onto this project was I had a similar vision for the way that this person wanted to do billing. So I'm getting from this person what exactly it is that they want. What is their vision? And I think the reason why I was able to get it more clearly was because I asked the right questions. Both of these vendors were quite young and new in creating their own business. And so I don't know if there was some possible inexperience there. I had been doing this for years, so that might have been some of the disconnect as well. But the first thing that I did was I gained clarity. I gained clarity as to what it is that we're wanting to do.
Which is great.
That right off the bat is going to eliminate a significant amount of the rework that's already being done. Not just the rework, but now it's also going to move the project forward. But now that I have clarity on what exactly is wanted and why and all of those, because I asked, then that's when I start breaking things down into the milestones or phases. This is a rather large project. So I broke it down into phases, and then those phases I broke down into milestones and so forth. And always part of that is, who are the stakeholders? Who do I need to talk to? Right. That always needs to be part of it. Especially in my line of work, there's always a lot of people that are involved in this process. And it's always good to get everybody's perspective. It's always interesting also to get some of the history as to why they're doing things. Often the answer is that's just because that's how we've always done it. Luckily, this organization hadn't been around long enough to where they'd been doing things a certain way for decades. So some of it was still rather new.
So you touch on an interesting point, and this isn't the central point of this episode, but getting an understanding of the history of why things are currently done the way they are is crucial in coming up with the right design, the right deliverables, even just change as a whole, right? Any new system or anything like that requires some amount of change management. And that's not just for getting systems switched over and things like that, but it's also people change management, right?
Yep.
People have to be able to get on board with what's happening, what's changing. And sometimes people have these long held, we've always done it this way. There's some specific requirement that everybody somehow remembers, but can't enunciate as to why something is done. No, we can't change it because X, Y, Z. We've got a great example of that for another episode, but we can't change that because this is how it's been done. And then you're hamstrung into this whatever that matches something that really could have been changed and should have been changed a long time ago. So I like that. I like how you went through there and found that as well.
And also a lot of the resistance that we find to change, especially where I am trying to improve efficiency for the sake of scaling, right? A lot of times that includes some form of automation, and people hear automation and they think, oh, I'm going to be out of a job. For whatever reason, they don't think, oh, I'm now going to be able to work more efficiently and get to everything that I have never had the time to get to. And I'm now going to be able to provide better service to the customer or the client or whatever, because now for whatever reason, they just automatically go to, I'm going to be out of a job. And so that's where a lot of resistance that we get when people hear automation or efficiency.
That's especially true today with AI stuff coming in, which we won't get into. There is that fear for a lot of people when in reality, I'm sure you've heard it your entire career. I've heard it my entire career. We need to get more done. We need more productivity with the people we have. And I have a hard time believing that companies are ready to say, we've got all this extra productivity. I guess we better cut our employees to go back down to our original, closer to our original productivity. That doesn't really make sense to me. But I do get the sentiment. The fear sometimes is there, but automation will cause that. So continue. Sorry.
No. So I get the history. And in getting the history, I now have a little bit of a better understanding of also how various people feel about it. So then that's on my radar as to how I approach certain things. I'm in so many strategy meetings. They're like, okay, this is what we're going to do. Okay, go out and do it. And people forget okay, how are we going to do it? I see this all over the place. I've sat in other organizations where you just create a sales funnel. Has anybody you don't just create a sales funnel. There's a lot of steps involved in it. And there's a lot to it, a lot more than just going out and creating a sales funnel. So I always chuckle because it sounds so easy, but no, it actually takes a lot of steps. The other thing talking about easy is a lot of people want to say, oh, we want to simplify. We want to simplify. Hopefully, really what they're wanting to do is simplify for their client and their customer. But what they don't realize is that in order to do that, to make it simple on the front end for their customer, there's a lot of complexity in the back.
Yes.
I call it duck mode, right? Because, there's a duck and it looks like it's gliding so effortlessly across the top of the water. When beneath the water, it's paddling heck, right? To get to where it's going. So a lot of people hurt themselves because they say, oh, we're going to simplify. That also means on the back end. And that just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. If you want to simplify, I'm all for simplifying.
But it takes a lot of work.
Yeah, for the sake of efficiency, absolutely. Let's cut out the waste. Let's cut out the bloat. But it doesn't mean that it's going to be easy and simple. So in order to avoid overwhelm, because that's really what we were trying to do. If people are sitting at their desks overwhelmed, they're not going to be productive, right? So it has to be broken down into bite-sized pieces, manageable pieces, but it also has to be broken down in a way that they can see where it's going. They can see where the progress is. They can see how what they're doing right now ties back to the overall objective of the project.
Yeah.
And so that's what I started to do for these vendors. I went to the person building the CRM and I specifically said, these are the data points. These are the fields that we need, because I also knew the end goal, right? We need to be able to do X, Y, Z. And so in order to do X, Y, Z, we need to collect ABC data. And so then I went specifically to that vendor. This is the specific data points that we need to collect. Okay, how are we going to collect that, right? Is it going to be manually put in? We want to eliminate that as much as possible, because then it either doesn't get put in or it gets put in incorrectly anytime you have human in there. The other thing that just kills me is when I go into an organization and they say, yeah, here's our system and there's this field in the system and it's really supposed to be for this, but I don't really capture that data. So I use the field for this. And then they wonder why their reporting doesn't work.
Because their data is not clean. And
that to me is, okay, you have boots on the ground that don't even understand the basics of how these systems function. You really just have people putting stuff in.
And that comes back to, I'm sure there was some discussion long before, right? That says, oh, we don't use that. So use that field for this other data or something like that, right?
Yeah. From
and
previous
if
management,
if you don't have that understanding, right? Mm-hmm. And that clarity, certainly the vendors wouldn't have had that unless they're given that somehow in documentation. So that's interesting. So you come into this thing, there hasn't been any clarity on an agreement. There hasn't been clarity on what's to be delivered. High level, sure, titles and whatnot, but no specifics on this is what we want. And then this is the type of things we want implemented as part of that solution. And so you start to find out some of this, you get this information from the powers that be, right? The top person, and then people who use the system, et cetera. What happens when you start to give that clarity to the vendors? How did that change?
It was like a miracle had happened.
Were you just like, to give us the whole tea, were you able to get it done in 3 months?
I'll get to that in a second, but I want to tell you what they said. What they said to me was, oh my gosh, before you came on, we had no idea what we were doing. And now we do. This is what the vendor said. Yes.
So the vendor had been working on this for nearly 6 months.
I had no idea.
And admitted to you, once they started to receive clarity, this is great. We didn't actually know what we were supposed to build. That's
correct.
That's scary. That's telling. That's very telling, as this is a huge failure.
Yes.
In this case. That's fascinating. So what happens next?
Okay. So we start working on it. The new CRM build actually doesn't take very long. What does take a little bit of time is some of the automations, the customized automations that take some coding, right? So some of that, the client portal takes way longer than the CRM does, because there's a lot that is all coding.
There's a lot.
It's all from scratch. Yeah. So that takes a while. And like I said, they had never spoken to each other. So then I'm getting them all in meetings. So they're talking to each other, and that starts flowing a lot better. But really, when it comes time for the migration, and we'll only touch briefly on this because, again, like we said, it could be a whole other podcast. The migration was a nightmare. And partly because, like I mentioned before, people would be like, oh yeah, this field is meant for this, but I don't collect that data. So I've been putting this data in that field. And when you're migrating data, it literally is, okay, put the data from this field in this system into this field in this system. I mean, at a high basic level.
But you're telling me that there were some people using the field for its intended purpose and some not. So there was different types of data in that field.
And then some were just not using it at all.
It's a nightmare.
And then the other thing too is because it took so long to get any changes to the old system made. If there wasn't a field to put that data in, they were putting it in notes. Notes is not searchable, but they didn't understand the whole concept of the foundation of how these systems work.
Or they just wanted the data saved.
It just wanted the data saved. They're literally treating it as a glorified Rolodex, right? Because as far as they're concerned, they just need to be able to go into that record and see the data and find the data. There was no concept of this is where the reports are pulled from. And mapping the data from the old system to the new system, especially since we were making some efficiency changes to the billing and that kind of thing. So the migration was probably the biggest headache of the entire thing. That and the fact that the client portals were not fully operational at the end of those 3 months. But like I said, we were launching at 3 months what we had. So let me tell you how this ends, and then we can get into these other issues a little bit deeper in some of our next episodes. So I'm given a hard deadline. It's a Tuesday of the week. And the other thing too, we're thinking at this point, the build and everything is going to go up to the deadline. We're going to have a day to test.
One day of testing. All of my QA friends across the industry their monitor just exploded.
But it gets worse. It gets worse. So I'm already freaking out about this one day of testing. And obviously, as the lead over this project, any bugs that are found are going to come to me. Anyways, so I'm already a little bit stressed about this. That Monday, the day before the launch, is going to be the test. Oh, I left out the part where the reason why I was given this hard deadline was because they were ending the contract with the former CRM on that date. So we were no longer going to have access to the former CRM on that date. And so we had to have the CRM ready by then because they did not want to pay for another year, month, or whatever of service from that CRM for all of the users. We had 50 plus users in the CRM.
Okay. So their hard deadline was for financial reasons. They were done with a contract. So this new one had to be there.
Yes.
You can maybe see from the management perspective, it had really gotten going 9 months probably when this is supposed to be cut off. Does that feel like plenty of time? I probably wouldn't feel like that's plenty of time just in and of itself, but it's not like they started the thing 3 months prior to the deadline.
No.
But then suddenly they didn't really have anything after 6 months. And so you come in and they're like, we don't have a choice. This is not just playing hardball. We're out of the other system in 3 months. That's interesting.
And my response is, we're going to do what we can do in 3 months. I can sit there and complain about how that's not enough time, or I can get to work and try to make it work. And I can do what I can do. So this was going to be a Tuesday because it was the end of the month. And so the subscription to the CRM was going to end at the end of the month. And so the new one needed to go live. So the other thing too is we're coming up to the crunch deadline. So I'm needing to train my people, but I don't have a system really yet to train them in, but I'm trying to create training. Anyways, that was a disaster. So I'm working all of this stuff Friday afternoon at 3:00 before the Tuesday deadline. I get a phone call from the person who hired me, which is the person who was managing the project before me. And this person says, oh, oops. I made a calculation error. We actually lose access to the CRM today at midnight, not on Tuesday.
Fascinating. So your day of test was really...
So there was no day of test. Matter of fact, so that following Monday, we had no system. We had no old system. We had no new system. And guess what my person that I reported to told us? I don't see what the problem is. It's just business as usual.
Which part's business as usual?
I make the executive decision to not ruin everybody's weekend. And I don't say anything to anybody that Friday afternoon. I let everybody go home and I say, next week is going to be an awesome week. We're going to roll out our new system. I spent the weekend drafting an email to all the employees, letting them know that this is the situation. It's not ideal. I understand that this is going to suck, but I really need you guys to just hang in there. Because my hands are tied. I have little control over a lot of these circumstances that are severely affecting the project, yet I'm the face of the project. Even before I had gotten the phone call on Friday, I was really trying to talk this up and make this a great experience. I planned a ribbon cutting ceremony. I got the thick red ribbon. I got the big scissors. I ordered donuts that had the company logo on it. I was trying to make this a big deal.
Your plan was to roll it out on a Tuesday. You were taking Monday to test. That again still just blows my mind. But then you find out that before Monday happens for people, right, there's going to be no other system. So what's the total impact of that? That's essentially a miss, right? It's a failure.
Huge miss.
to do that. So what was the impact both from a people perspective and financially to that company? Or do you know that full impact?
I don't know the full impact financially because I wasn't always privy to that. That was another thing that this person kept very close to them.
Which might be fine depending on
fine, yeah.
how they're doing that. Yeah.
The impact, the frustration from the employees, completely justified. But the other thing too that I wanted to note was Monday morning when everybody got to work and got my email, guess who was nowhere in the building?
The top guy.
Yeah. He was well aware of this ribbon cutting ceremony that I had planned that I told him I was still going to move forward with.
Yeah.
Didn't show up for that.
That in and of itself causes an issue, I think, amongst the group, of the team, the employee, to see a lack of upper support there.
Oh, yeah.
So that would definitely take an impact on the company. Certainly there was a financial impact.
Yes.
You may not know exactly what that was, but not being able to have a system that's critical to the company moving forward, even if it was for one day. Did the next one get up on Tuesday?
So we were able to launch the one on Tuesday, but it was still very painful because nobody had ever seen it. I had seen it because I had helped with the design.
But there was no time for training, no time for people change management.
Exactly. There was no time for that. It was literally jump in. Let me give you guys an overview. And over the next couple of weeks, obviously I took groups in and we did do proper training, but those first couple of weeks were painful. I was inundated with bugs, and really what the bugs were, the data didn't migrate correctly.
Because it wasn't clean data to be.
Yeah.
We're going to talk through all these episodes about failures across projects or cases and what could have been done different. I think it's important for us also to highlight this is the impact of these series of failures, right?
Oh, yeah.
And impacts will differ and vary by circumstance.
Yes.
But there is an impact, right? The reason we want to try to learn from all these different cases and get better at what we're doing is because we don't want to suffer a lot of these major impacts that will happen either financially to the company or to the culture of the company. For people to come into work and suddenly everything they're used to doing is frustrated, that takes a toll on individuals and employees. And getting them, if none of them were brought along, if none of them knew what the new system was even going to look like or how it was going to be used, and then suddenly they have to jump into that without any training, that can be really difficult as well. And that can all be fixed if these failures are avoided.
And we had 2 people quit that first day because they were just so frustrated. It was so painful. It's hard for me to adequately describe how painful it was and the frustration because they were still actively taking phone calls from customers, but they weren't able to see any information. And so one of the strategies that I told them is we're going to take our customers at face value for the next 2 days. If they say that they did this, they did it. If they say that we didn't do this, then we didn't do this because we had no way to verify that. So I'm sure there was some cost there because we were probably giving away services that we otherwise probably would not have. So
Interesting.
But the other interesting thing was at the end of the day on Monday, the person who had managed the project prior to me, who was the person that I reported to, did finally show up, asked how the day went. And I'm trying to be positive. All things considered, it went okay. We did have 2 employees quit. And he said, maybe we just weeded out the week.
Ouch. That's really terrible. If you maybe not directly cause a problem, but certainly had a huge hand in it, and then to dismiss that, I think is tough. That's a tough cultural issue in an organization. We're going to talk about this case over the next several episodes because there's more to unpack along the way. But the biggest thing to take away to start with is that clearly there was a lack of clarity and visibility with the agreement of what was to be done. And that caused issues not just in the company, because essentially the vendors were the consulting group, right? Doing the work for this. And so a lack of clarity came from the company to the vendors. But I think there's also, not that we're trying to distribute blame or fault, but I think there's also something to learn for those vendor companies.
Yes.
Because if you're doing work for a client and they give you something pretty vague, you should absolutely ask more questions and get in there and say, no, we need more detail.
Yeah.
Again, do you not trust us? No, we want to create the best product for you. And so it's not about that. The vendors should have definitely gone in and said, no, we need more clarity on what this means. What are all the things we're actually delivering? That would have gotten more information about the integrations with the other vendors' stuff. And then they could have probed more there and said, how do we interact with them more often and get on the same page that way? I think here in this instance, certainly there's more to unpack along the way of this project, but right off the bat, the agreement, the clarity on deliverables was not there. And if you have no deliverables clearly defined, you can't then have clearly defined phases and milestones along the way, which we'll get into in the next episode for sure.
At the end of the day, really the whole point to all of this is that the fact that they came to me after I came on and they said, we had no idea what we were doing, then they should never have signed the contract. If you do not have a clear understanding of what you are supposed to be delivering to the client, you should not be signing that contract. That contract should not ever be executed. Needs to be some pushback.
And even if you got a little bit, maybe it's going to trickle in, you should absolutely push back every time. What's the next piece? We're not being given enough information for this. So I think that's very interesting. This is a fascinating case. It's one of those where we have to have this done. We don't quite know how to do this, but you only have this long. One of the biggest lessons for me is if your vendors, in this case, they should have been probing and asking more questions too. This is on them as much as it is
the
company that you were working for. But if your vendors don't know what they're building, the problem is not in the execution, which is the quickest thing to look at and try to blame. It's definitely in the agreement. It's in the deliverables and the lack of clarity there. The biggest takeaway for this episode is have clear agreements. Make sure that's visible across your entire team. Otherwise, you're going to end up with these failures and the impacts.
A wasted 6 months wandering in the desert and still not being complete.
Yeah, super fascinating. This was great. Thanks for bringing this case and having us talk about this one. This is a lot of lessons, and I think there's more to come, right?
Oh, yeah. In our next episode, we're going to continue with the same case study, the same project, but we're going to now dive a little bit deeper into the missing milestones and the profound effect that had on the success or lack of success of the project.
Join us next time. Thanks for sticking with us through this one.
All right, that's the case for this week.
In our next episode, we'll keep working the same engagement and break down the next layer of where execution started to slip and what should have been caught earlier.
If you're seeing versions of this work in your own work, you're not alone. Make sure you're subscribed to the Bryce and Rhonda Work the Case podcast so you don't miss what comes next.
And if you want the full written breakdown, you can find our Working the Case newsletter on LinkedIn, where we introduce and go deeper into each of these engagements.
So make sure you're subscribed there as well.
See you later.